Thank you very much, Lily. This is a book, by the way. And if you'd have asked me some time ago whether I wanted to be a dean, whether I'd be in academia or whatever it is, I would have said you're a lunatic. I had no interest in any of that. And in fact, at one point in time, an old colleague called me up and said, I'd like to nominate you for Dean of Engineering. And I actually laughed. But I was kind of tickled at the same time. So I went home and I told my wife that, and she laughed. And the next day I was at the office and I told my executive vice president, and he laughed. So I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody anything anymore, because it was just silly, okay? My temperament was not suited to be academic again. My sense of timing was not, my long range was what academia would call getting started, okay, or maybe thinking about it. But a funny thing happened along the way. I went from the commercial world, building and running 3 companies, to the Defense Department and DARPA, and I spent a total of 4 years there. The last 3 were the Director of Information Technology, which was both a kind of a monumental job, but on top of that, a physically exhausting job, so that by the end of the 3rd year, I decided I was only going to spend 1 more year, and then I was going to take a year off. And simultaneously with that, I got a call from a headhunter at the University of Maryland, who said, we're looking for a dean, would you like to be a candidate? And I laughed, okay? Because again, it was a kind of absurd thing. I said, no. And she said, okay. I said, but I'll tell you what, send me a job description and I'll send you a bio. I'm not applying for a job or anything like that. I'll just send you a bio. I got the job description, and everybody reads what they want into a job description, right? It's not, I don't even have a copy of the original job description anymore. Well, when I read it, it said they wanted a business executive, had to know technology, commercial experience, government experience, and academic experience for all pluses. And they wanted an entrepreneur. And I said, that's me. So I actually did send in my full resume. And that was a big deal because I wasn't looking for a job. I didn't want a job. And on top of that, the University of Maryland does business with the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So I had to recuse my office from me being involved in any management decisions that involved Maryland. Okay, so that was a big deal, okay, because otherwise I'd be violating some kind of conflict of interest agreement. So now I had been a university professor at the beginning of my career at Berkeley in engineering. But when you're a junior professor, you have no idea what it takes to really do a search, or you're looking for a dean. And I got a call from the headhunter again saying, well, now you have to show up for an interview. And I said, well, how many candidates are there? She said, about 15, 16. And I said, no way. When you got 3 candidates, I'll come. And she said, it's not the way it works. We want to go to the next pass, And so I looked at my calendar, and it just so happened I was going to be passing the University of Maryland on 495 on a Tuesday night, going to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey for Wednesday morning defense reviews. And I said, hoping that they would just say, screw you, go away. I said I could be interviewed at 8 o'clock at night. She said, okay. I said, damn, because I really want a job. I was planning on taking a year off. And that night, I had no concept of what traffic between Virginia and Maryland was like. It was miserable. And on top of that, it was raining.
Oh my God.
Hard. And on top of that, they'd given me the wrong directions. So that they said, you have to go to night school, the night school. I hadn't been at the University of Maryland since 1975 when I gave a talk during the day. And all I remembered were colonial columns on buildings. And I couldn't find the building. And so I kept driving back and forth on University Boulevard until finally I found the only building in sight which could possibly be it. It was University College, by the way. And I said, I've got to park here. And it was 1 minute of 8, and my interview was at 8. And I was like 90-10, thinking I'm going to just turn around and go on to Fort Monmouth. And I went and asked somebody in the building, is this night school? And they said, huh? I said, well, look, I'm going to go down to the basement, which is where the room was, and just check it out. And I walk in, and there are 20 people there waiting for me. Okay? Now, I am drenched by this time. And they said, okay, well, why would you make an opening statement? Now, I didn't, a week before, I didn't even know the University of Maryland had a business school. Okay, it was only 20 miles from my house. I didn't really know that. And I had no idea what a dean does. I'd never been a dean. I'd never met the dean when I was at Berkeley. I had never met the dean when I was teaching as an adjunct at Warden. Okay? So I said, let me tell you why I'm here. What other opening statement could I have? And they said, okay, well, why are you here? So I said, well, here's the resume. Here's what I read in the job description. Here's my background. And that lasted, instead of a 5-minute opening statement, it was a 20-minute opening statement, because as you noticed, I got gray hair and I've been around for a while, and I've done a lot of things. And then somebody said, what would you do if you were dean? And I had an instant bifurcation of answer, which was, I don't have an idea at all, or make something up. So I made up the only thing that made any sense whatsoever. Okay, I said I would build a school that is a leading technology-oriented business school in the nation. And when it came out of my mouth, it made great sense. And why did I actually say that? Because 10 years or 8 years earlier, I had been asked to teach a course, and I'm going to take a deep breath because the course was a very long title. It was called Science, Technology, Change, and Entrepreneurship, into the MBA program. And it was about how technology and business interact. And I discovered that nobody gave a damn. Okay? The faculty didn't care. The students, I had a total of 13 students in the class out of a very large MBA population. I was asked when I was at DARPA to come up and talk about technology at the Warden School, and there were fewer people in the room than are here now. Nobody cared. And then I actually wrote an article about that, about the disjoint between business and technology and why business people go astray. Because they don't understand technology, and it would be a joke, why do businessmen have bald spots right on top of their head? Because they're always going, oh my God. They're always being shocked by something which happens from technology that came from left field, even though it was right in front of their eyes for the last 2 or 3 years. So about a month passed, and they said, well, now you've got to come to the university and you've got to be interviewed. And I said, by whom? I said, by everybody. If you've been involved in a dean's search, Tom, I know you've been involved in a dean's search, and Kurt, you too, but if you've been involved in a dean's search, you know that everybody in the world is going to, have to listen to you at one time or another. So I came for, and they said, but this time we're going to tell you when to come. And it's going to be 2 days. I actually took vacation off from DARPA. And I discovered it really was everybody in the world. It was all the students, all the faculty, et cetera, et cetera. But one particular meeting really was very interesting. I was, people would say, well, what are you going to do as dean? And I would keep talking the technology thing. First I could talk a sentence, then I could talk a paragraph, then I could talk a page. Then I started actually thinking about it, and I could actually make some coherent, pronouncements that were more than just glib. And I went to a luncheon on the first day with the deans, or a number of deans, and I was talking technology, and one of them said, "Well, what makes you think you can do that, in an academic environment?" And I said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. I wasn't born with a mustache. Okay, I started growing my mustache in 1979. I can remember the very day that I started, and within 6 months of me growing the mustaches started popping up around the company." And I said, "That's because people follow leaders." And some dean said, "Lucky you didn't start wearing a brassiere." And of course, the room exploded in laughter. And I said, "I want this job." In my head, okay? Because I really fell in love with the people. I didn't give a damn about the position, actually, because I didn't know what it did yet. But I wanted the job. This is documented in the book as well. And then I actually did get the job, because otherwise I wouldn't have written the book. And my first step was to find out what a dean does. Okay, and I discovered a dean is a CEO. Okay, and in fact, I had been the CEO of sort of a modest-sized company and a large company, and so you've always got people above you that are telling you what not to do, how to do it, and there are always corporate expenses that are falling down on your head. So I know how to operate in an environment where you're not the final sole authority. And I'd also worked in the government, so I'd learned to operate in a bureaucracy. That was great training. If I had gone just from the commercial world to the university world, I would have probably done one of two things: quit or shot myself. Because it's impossible to work in a bureaucracy unless you've learned how to do it before. You can't learn for the first time here. So now in trying to figure out what a dean does, I decided what I would do is I would interview everybody in the school, which was not that big a deal. At the time, there were about 70 faculty members and maybe 35 or 40 staff members. And I started on day 2, okay? And I said, I'm going to interview like four faculty and 1 or 2 staff every day. By the time you finish a week of that, your head is spinning. You can't remember who's who. You can't remember what anybody told you, but you start getting a picture of what the place looks like. And I actually decided also, I started at the letter L because I'm working down and up. So I go, I and then M, I'd work that way. That way people would think it took half as long for me to get to them. And when they walked into my office, I told them I have three goals. Number 1, I want to understand what the school is like, the strengths and weaknesses. Number 2, someday I'm going to want something from you, and I want you to know me as an individual, not as a name on a door. And number 3, I'd like you to feel comfortable in coming and talk to me. And by within 2 months or so, I had a pretty good picture of what the school was like. And it was actually kind of sad. Okay? The school was, people outside the school don't ever appreciate this, no matter when I told them to them. The school was like an orphan child. The university really didn't give a damn about it. The university didn't understand its programs. The university had flooded the school with undergraduate students to the point where the faculty had remained basically constant and the number of students had doubled. There were students that were dumped into the school that had no hope of ever graduating. The faculty was overloaded, really overloaded and tired. They were very good, but they were very tired. And the school was the number 1 lowest funded of all of the 13 schools on campus. And you would walk outside of the business school and you would say that to people and they would tell you you're full. The school's rich, it's got all these wonderful everythings. Okay? Because we had a building which was very nice, but half the size of what we needed. It had started planning in 1975, got built in about 1993. And we had staff in offices the size of closets. We had no room for adjuncts. Students got taught in 17 classrooms around campus, so there was no way of building a coherent culture. The two things that were powerful about the school is it had a very good faculty, too small but very good, and it had a culture of collaboration, which is very unusual in academia. So, for example, my two experiences before Maryland had been Wharton and Berkeley, and if you said to either group of faculty on those two campuses, "Follow me," they'd all walk out the door in the opposite direction. No way you could get them to collaborate. Whereas here, people would actually work together for common goals. I didn't have anything to do with that. Okay? I mean, it was luck, two kinds of luck. One kind of luck that was there, and the second kind of luck was my luck, because I didn't even know enough to look for that as one of the things I would need. Okay? So, I mean, I really got lucky. By the way, the secret of success in business or in academia, the number one part of it is luck. Okay? I've been very lucky. So, then we began a process. One of the interviews that I had was with a faculty in the management organization department who said, "We'd like to come and brief you on our strategy." I didn't even know we had a strategy, but I said, "Great." And they gave me an hour briefing, which was kind of nice, not very interesting, but kind of nice. And I said to the other department chairs, "Well, let's all do it." So in the period of about another month, so we're into maybe month 3 or 4, I had strategic briefings from each of the faculty. And one of the things I noticed was that while people reported problems as being problems in their department, there were certain sets of problems that were common to every department. Underfunding for summer research, too many students, too large classes. There were about a half a dozen things, not enough space. And I was a strategist, and so I started writing a strategic plan, a draft strategic plan, and saying, okay, now we have to fix those problems. And one common weakness of everybody was not enough money. You all know how to live with not enough money, right? We've lived through it a lot. But it was really not a lot of money. In fact, the budget of the school at that time was $14.4 million. Okay. That, I don't know if you have a reference point. That had been the round-off era of my office budget at DARPA. But my budget there was $350 million. That really was the round-off era. Okay? The Warden School had a budget of just a school, not University of Pennsylvania, of $100 million. A modest Midwestern public university like Michigan State had budgets of $40 to $50 million. So here was a business school with $14.4 million, and also the highest student-to-faculty ratio. Highest, that means that many students per faculty. We had 10% of the students on campus and 5% of the faculty. Okay. And a number of other things like that. So we set upon a set of goals. This was all in the first strategic plan, and it's in the appendix of the book. We set upon a bunch of goals to fix those problems. Okay? One problem was too many undergraduate students. Okay, but let me say what I meant by that. In 1990 or 93 or 4, there were 2,000 undergraduate students. When I arrived in 1997, there were 3,500 graduate students. Why did that happen? They all paid tuition. And they wanted to get into the business school, so they let them in. The faculty hadn't changed by more than 2 or 3 at that time. So it was on a path towards some kind of devastating debacle. And by the way, a few years later, I plotted the number of graduates of the school. Okay, not number coming in, but number going out. And it had remained constant, even while the number of students kept going like that. So that was another problem we had to fix. Now, how do you fix something like that? And it depends whether you're a gentleman or you want to get something done. All right? We got a new undergraduate assistant dean about a year after I arrived, and she was telling me about these problems. I hadn't figured it out by that time. I'm a slow learner. And she said, there's nothing we can do. University doesn't care. Nobody's wanting to do anything. And I said, I come from a world where there's always something you can do. You can always do something. Okay? It may be unpleasant. You may not want to do it, but you can always do something. I said, for example, we could raise the requirements on the basic core courses and flunk half the students in the school out. We do that. All I have to do is go talk to a half a dozen faculty, and they would probably all be thrilled to raise the requirements. Right? By the way, if I had asked them to lower the requirements, they'd have fought me tooth and nail forever. But if I'd asked them to raise the requirements, I knew I could do that. So I said, I'm not sure I want to do that, but why don't you go down the hill? But down the hill for us is the administration. Okay? And why don't you say, by the way, she didn't know me, I only knew her for about a week. I said, why don't you go and say that Howard Frank is whispering under his breath that he's going to flunk out half the students. And you can say you don't know whether I'll do it or not, but why don't you just say that? And then, if you're a dean, you have a meeting with the provost every month, and you just talk about issues. Sometimes they yell at you, sometimes they don't. And so when I went down to the next meeting with the provost, I said, let me tell you what I told Pat. And I repeated verbatim what I told Pat. And I said, I don't know whether I want to do that or not, but I might be forced to. Now, within 2 months, we began talking about a new admissions policy for the business school. And here again, luck plays a lot into it. We had something called provisional admits, and we agreed, and we hated it. Because what it meant is you told the student they were in the school, and then after 2 years, if they didn't make the grade, you told them they were out of the school, instead of not letting them into the school unless they were making the grade. So we'll eliminate provisional admits if we start a freshman admit program and just fully admit students. And if we set the goals high enough for the freshman admit program, we're willing to unconditionally accept them. If they flunk out, they flunk out. But other than that, so we agreed. We would have up to 400 freshman admits, and we would have another 400 in the junior year. That's 800. We had about 1,500 juniors then. So over a course of 5 years or so, the numbers would fall to about 800 juniors and a comparable number of seniors. And we would admit somebody if they had an SAT of 1,300 or higher. Okay, this is on the 1,600 scale. And I'm just going to give you the bottom line because there were a lot of steps in between. Within 5 years, we were at the 800. We had the highest SATs on campus, the highest graduation rates, the lowest dropout rates, and a splendid undergraduate class. By the way, though, because the thing that I learned very quickly, academia is not the same as the commercial world. You can actually trust people, and administration is in the commercial world. You can't trust university administrators. They change, they don't adhere to the previous deals or whatever. So the next year we began throwing out students who hadn't made the grade, and we threw out hundreds of students, hundreds and hundreds for 2 more years, because they weren't going to make it anyway. And the university hates that. Why? Because every student who gets expelled, their parents call them, and then their lawyers call them. Okay? So we didn't make a lot of friends downtown. Downtown meaning down at the bottom of the campus. All right, that's only a little part of the problem. This was a very poor school. We introduced new programs with a revenue sharing arrangement with the university. We started a part-time MBA program in Baltimore. We started a part-time MBA program in DC. After 5 years, we had 1,000 part-time students generating $20 million of revenue. Remember, the business school's total revenue was $14 million when we started. None of it, the university gave us a dime. Just not a dime came from the university. We built a building, half of it at least, with our own money. Nothing came from the university. When I left 11 years later, the revenues of the business school were $64 million. Okay. When I started, we had 70 faculty, and we ranked about 68th on a research website that said, how do we compare to everybody else? By the time we finished, we'd hired about 140. We had 140 people. We hired the best people from all over the country, I could say the world, but mostly the country. And we'd stolen people from just every top school you can imagine. And we ranked top number 5 in the world. We have 4 departments in the top 10 right now. And we did that because we had the money to do it. Right. That generated a whole bunch of other problems. In fact, I just want to read one thing. It was one of the reviews. And some dean said it. This was the review committee for my reappointment. He has captured an unreasonable fraction of resources of the university for his college. He takes what he can get and never gives back. Okay? Well, now we hadn't captured any resources from the university actually, but who knows, all right? And so that the reputation of the Smith School was rich. It wasn't the Smith School in the beginning, but that the business school was rich, actually came true. And so now hate us for what we are, not for what we aren't. Now a number of other things happened. The run wasn't completely successful. We proved time and again that we could do business in the worst possible way internationally. We started programs in China that turned out to be a debacle. That part of it was culture, part of it was our inability to just sort of master international business. Part of it was the university's bureaucracy. Okay, we were competing against schools like USC, who could bring a student in a week or in a day, and it took our graduate school 6 months to do the same thing. We started a program in Zurich, along with another school, that was turned out to be another debacle. We nearly had debacles in Tunisia. The only reason we didn't was I canceled the program, because it was clear that it was going to be a debacle. So the international aspects of our, let's say, growth are still to be accomplished, and is not possible at today's University of Maryland. Okay. University of Maryland can't do business internationally. It just doesn't work. Our relations with the rest of the university went from mediocre to rotten on a good day. Okay, Our relations with the administration, I didn't get fired, by the way, until my 10th year. All right? That's because we were getting too many results. But after the 10th year, I only had one more year. They didn't reappoint me for another 5 years. Of course, I wasn't planning on being reappointed for another 5 years anyway. But they just couldn't put up with my style. Everybody started getting fed up with the fact that we would do it whether or not somebody would let us do it. There's an old joke about, asking for forgiveness as opposed to permission. In a bureaucracy, you can't ask for permission because the answer is always no. Always. And the difference between my government experience and my university experience was in the government, we had a corporate counsel who I'd go into his office and I say, here's what I want to do. And he had, the usual row of, law books, wall to wall. And he said, I can give you any one of 10 different books that tell you where you can't do it. And then he would think for a second, he'd pull out one book, and he'd open up to one paragraph, and he said, under this paragraph, we can do it. And the reason is, you see this word "and" here? It's not clear whether it's inclusive or exclusive. And if we choose to interpret it as exclusive, we could do it. And that's our cover. And here, you'd call corporate counsel and you say, here's what I want to do. And you wouldn't hear back from them for a year. So you do it anyway, right? That's what you do. Now, if you're looking to maintain your position, you don't do it. If you don't give a damn about your position other than the fact that you like working it, but you don't care whether or not you get fired, you do what you need to do. So now, why did I write the book? I wrote the book for two reasons. One, because the run that we had was extraordinary. Okay? I don't think it's ever been done in any business school, ever, anywhere. But secondly, because it's at least a primer on how to deal with the bureaucracy. And if you're willing to actually learn from the ideas, not necessarily copy what we did, you can figure out how to deal with the bureaucracy. So I wanted to actually see if I could create something that gave some guidelines of how you could interact and operate in a bureaucracy. I told the truth, okay? What I didn't do is I didn't use names. I used positions. So all you have to do is get out a directory. You can figure it out. But at least I can only get sued secondhand. I can't say, aside from one or two individuals in the senior administration, that I even liked anybody by the time I left. Okay? I lived through 3 provosts, 2 presidents. I liked the first provost. I really disliked the next 2. And it reminded me of when I went to my first dean's meeting, which was like 6 months after I took office. One dean came up, we're talking about faculty and provosts. That's what you talk about at dean's meetings. And one dean said to me, when I'm with the provost, I never express an opinion, because if I do, he always does the opposite thing. And another guy comes up to me and says, what's the real job of a dean? This was a dean of a Southern university. I don't know what he's talking about. And what's the real job of it? He said, to keep the 50% of the faculty who hate you away from the 50% who haven't made up their minds yet. And then he said, how do you know which is which? And he said, here's what you do. You go out after work and you see faculty members in the parking lot and you wave to them and see how many fingers they wave back. I'll be delighted to answer any questions. Anybody? Yeah, Kurt.
Thank Thank you, Howard. I enjoyed the remarks, and we miss you at the Smith School at the top. So happy to see you around the hallway. One thing I'm wondering is your views on the whole trend of using technology in education in the university and in the business school. Certainly combines areas of your strength. We know that President Lowe is very interested in doing more in terms of whether it's flipped classroom, blended learning, online programs, and we're certainly looking at those ourselves in the Swiss School. But any thoughts in terms of that whole direction?
Yeah, okay, thanks. I have a lot of thoughts in terms of that. It starts off back in 1980 or 1981 when the PC was first introduced. And it was a toy. And I looked at it as a toy. Now, meanwhile, I had a division of my company that was generating $1 million of sales a year by selling applications on a particular application on mainframes. And within 5 years, that business was dead as a doornail. Because now we were selling $10,000 applications on a PC as opposed to generating $100,000 to $200,000 a year per customer of revenue on a mainframe. And that was a great lesson for me because I thought they were toys also. Now, I look at the stuff now, and if you compare now to what a good professor in a classroom can do, there's no comparison. The conventional sort of education augmented by technology is much superior. But every time I think about that, I think about that PC experience. And this technology would get better and better and better and better. And there's no reason why at some point in time it can't be a real threat to conventional education. Now, I don't think conventional education is going to go away. The social aspects of a university, good university, are very powerful. And if you think about the attraction of a university, it's not just the learning part. It's actually that may become the secondary part, but it's the fact that a large group of people get together in a tribe. Okay? And that's very important. Now, the other part of that is if the cost of education continues going up at the rate that it has been and wipes out the economic ability of the middle class to actually attend the social factory, then they're not going to stop being educated. Okay? They're going to go to alternatives. And I've seen enough alternatives that work. At one time I was in Australia and we went to the outback and we stayed on a cattle ranch for a few days, and the owner of the cattle ranch took us out to her a little just one room building. Okay? And she says, here's where all of my children were educated, over the radio. Okay? And one of them is a doctor, another is a lawyer, and I don't remember what she said the third one was. Now, would they be better off if they'd been gone to school? I'm sure. They may all be, complete social introverts for all we know. But at least educational-wise, they had replaced, because they didn't have any alternative, the conventional experience with a radio over the air, which was famous, I think, in Australia. So there's plenty of examples where people go to alternatives because they have no better option. And I think with technology improving constantly, in particular transmission technologies, where you can literally holographically put somebody in a seat nowadays and have a simulated classroom, I think it will be a real threat, and I can't give any predictions about when that real threat is going to be. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about why the international programs didn't? You said they weren't working?
They didn't work.
And you're still offering international?
Yeah, there's some, right.
You can talk about the ones maybe that are working versus?
Yeah, sure. Virtually nothing worked. Okay, it starts off okay, but then quickly declines. There's a wonderful book called Mr. China, Anybody read that? It's two investment bankers in the early to mid 1990s who go to China with $50 million of real money to invest. And it shows how they lose their money, sometimes a little at a time, sometimes a third at a time, because they didn't understand the Chinese culture. Okay? And part of the experience that we had was the same. And I'll give you a very simple example to just illustrate it. We rate all classes, and all students get a chance to fill out a form that says how the faculty is doing. We wanted to do that in our MBA classes in China. And the Chinese dean, our counterpart, said, our students don't rate their professors. And if you do it, we're going to have real problems. Okay. By real problems, he would not really tell us what the real problems would be. But we went ahead and did it anyway. And a young Chinese woman who was actually the administrative assistant that we hired in China had administered the ratings, and she was fired preemptively. And the guy said, if she shows up on your payroll, you better watch it. Okay, that was just one little example. Okay, another example. If you're an international student, you have to demonstrate language proficiency, right? And we have testing here. Well, how do you demonstrate language proficiency in China when the testers are in the U.S.? They refuse to allow teleconferencing. They refuse to allow our faculty or our testers to administer the tests. We had to pay for the testers to fly to China and test. Okay. That was another thing. A third thing is we have, I'm going to make a political statement, we have an insane graduate student that handles graduate admissions, even though it doesn't have the expertise to do it, or the people to do it. And so you get a large number of applications from an international location. They have to, first of all, evaluate the credentials. So if you're in a graduate program, you have to have an undergraduate degree. We insist on a 4-year undergraduate degree. The standard in, for instance, Switzerland is 3 years. Okay. We rejected students with 3 years undergraduate degrees. Okay. The former dean of the business school, the guy who took over my position, had a 3-year degree from Oxford, okay, which they wouldn't have accepted if he were applying to graduate school. So that knocked off more students. So we found ourselves at a competitive disadvantage in terms of who we could admit and how quickly we could admit them. When, for example, a competitor school, just like it's not like USC, USC, could come in, give the student an interview, and admit them on the spot. So when you do enough of these little things, it just turns out to be impossible. It also turned out that we couldn't figure out how to send money to China. Just couldn't do it. The system here could not transfer money to a Chinese bank without going through all sorts of gyrations, and then the money wouldn't get there. So at one point we were evicted from our offices for not paying the rent. So what we had was that we had our employees running around using money machines in China to get cash to pay the rent. And there are probably a dozen other things that I could think of. But so we were systematically, it wasn't any one individual or one fault, it was a systematic fault of a state system which is not set up to do international business, except, for instance, in the US. We also can't teach courses in other languages other than English. So if you want to hire the world's best teacher in China who could only speak Chinese, you can't do it. Can't give credit for it. So there are a lot of obstacles. Now, we keep plugging away. We closed down the Chinese program and started it up again. And it's hanging in there. Okay? I can't say it's successful. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can you give a specific example when the administration or legal counsel here said no, and you went ahead and did it?
No, they wouldn't say no. They would
Oh,
not say anything.
I didn't say anything.
They would not say anything. I learned that actually in the government. It's a wonderful technique. I reported to the deputy director, the director and the deputy director of DARPA. And I was sitting in his office, and we were chatting, and he was perusing some papers on his desk. And he comes up across one paper, and he says, "Damn it, I'm not going to approve that." And he also used somebody's name. And I said, "What do you do about it?" He said, "Nothing." He throws it in his inbox again. And I said, "How come?" He says, "Well, if I disapprove it, he's just going to go over my head, go to the director, and he could catch the director on the day when I'm out, and the director is not going to know what's going on. He's just going to sign it." So he said, "I'll just leave it like this. He won't. The guy I'm talking about, he won't know that I didn't approve it for another 6 months." This is a real story. It really happened, and that's what you do when you want to not put your neck out. I learned that also. I did it too. It's a great technique. Now, the university does that all the time. How do they do it? They refer to a committee. You don't want to make a decision for 6 or 8 months or 10 months, or give it to the Senate. You've got a good year before you have to actually deal with it. Bureaucracy does have its tools. Yes?
I'm starting to read a little now about education analytics, where supposedly the academic environment is trying to apply business intelligence kinds of things to the way they run. Your views on the bureaucracy sort of makes me feel that that's never going to work.
That's what I was thinking again when you just said it. It's never going to work. I was struck by something. I was in Poland, and we had at one point an arrangement. I don't want to say it was a program, but we were supporting a Polish program. And I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a graduation. And so I was up on the stage, and the Polish deans and rector came marching in. And I looked at them, and I could swear they were dressed like priests. Their academic robes were exactly like the priesthood. And then I read something that said the two slowest changing institutions on earth are formal religion and academia. Right? You're not going to change it by scientific methods. It's going to evolve, but it's going to evolve very slowly, and it's only going to evolve in spots. The reason that the business school was as big a pain in the ass as we were, not because we were trying to do anything wrong. We were trying to do things too fast for the system. And they just didn't want to deal with it. I've got notes in my review. They say they do things without asking for advice, and then we have to spend more time fixing it. Well, the first part of that was true, and the second part was also true. We ask for advice, you're not going to get any, and you're going to be told don't do it, so you don't ask for advice. Okay? The second part is they have to spend time fixing it to get it into the form that they're comfortable with. I'll give you a perfect example. The school's budget, as I said, was well over $60 million when I left. Of that, $15 million was state subsidy. Okay? You wonder where the 1/3 or 30% of the state monies come. They come with a base budget. Every school has one. The The libraries have one. Okay, so less than 1/4 of our budget was state budget. Yet, the finance people insisted that every part of the state budget be balanced. And I would say, it's impossible. We're spending over $60 million a year. You can't balance a $15 million budget. We don't have a $15 million budget. We've got a $65 million budget. Yet they would make us go through all kinds of gyrations. Take our finance people weeks and weeks and weeks to put it in a form that they could understand, as opposed to put it in a form that made business sense. And we like that in a million different things.
Was it the state or the university, or the one in the?
The way it goes, I didn't know anything about university finance when I got here. The way it goes is that every school or unit gets a state budget. Let's say, so the business school's budget is $15 million. And then most schools have a little bit of extra money that they generate. A little bit. You know, for instance, engineering has a lot they generated from research contracts. Okay? The business school started off with maybe $1 million of non-state budget money. And that grew to over $50 million. So that money was not part of our state budget. Yet when we got cuts, we get that cut also. So the university, every time the university had a cutback, they would take a certain percentage of the state budget, but they'd also take a certain percentage of the total revenues. And the excuse was that, well, otherwise we can't cut athletics and things like that because they don't have state budgets. They're all self-generated. But yeah, so people would know that we're taking money away from you, but you have to put it all back into a balanced state budget. It makes no sense. Never did get through. And in fact, after a while, my CFO got burned out also, and she couldn't talk to the people in finance as well, because it made no sense. Yes?
Wasn't at one point UCLA their business school going to stop taking state money? And I think that they were saying that they would just keep the name, but they would no longer accept money from the state so that they could then do whatever they wanted to do with whatever. You know, they were totally dependent on whatever revenues they could bring in. But whatever they brought in, they could do what they wanted.
There was discussion of that, but it went nowhere.
Oh, okay.
Because we had a provost who was in favor of it, but he said the other deans would not be, number one. Plus the fact, number two, they wouldn't let us do whatever we wanted anyway. So it's called a Hobsons Choice, I think. That would have been ideal. You know, one of the things, if I could talk about university finances for a second, we charge the same undergraduate tuition as every other school on campus. But we add a lot more value. You know, if you wanted to go to a private undergraduate business school, first tier or second tier, you'd end up spending something like $35,000 a year tuition or more. Okay, whereas we get $8,000 to $8,000 of tuition. We don't get it either. The university keeps it. The way it really goes is the business school, when I left, was the only school on campus that was actually self-generated. So that the university would keep all of the undergraduate tuition and a portion of the graduate tuition. And when I calculated that, it came to somewhere between $35 and $40 million a year that the university was keeping. They'd give us back $15 million, and we'd get some scholarship money. So when you added it up, we were getting about a total value of about $20 million and giving 35 to 40 to the university. So you don't make that up in volume. And we had proposed that we just sort of make it neutral. Okay, we keep what we generate, and we'll pay the university a fee, because you are a campus citizen and you are getting free services, although sometimes they don't look too free. Anybody else? Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.